Hey, welcome to another episode of 10 Minute Philosophy, the show that's bringing the tools of critical thought into the 21st century, 10 minutes at a time. According to my to-do list today, we're focusing on philosophical terms, and the term of the day is hegemony, or more precisely, cultural hegemony. Now, this is an important concept that in many ways is the backbone of a lot of contemporary cultural theory and behavioral science. The word has been around for a long time. It derives from the Greek verb meaning to lead, but it's usually associated with ideas about domination and control, as in the means by which one group dominates and controls another. So let's start by thinking of it as a special type of agreement. It's an agreement in which the person agreeing doesn't necessarily understand what it is that they've agreed to. The author most commonly associated with the contemporary use of the term is a Marxist thinker named Antonio Gramsci, although he was building on the work of a lot of people who came before him, like Nietzsche, Machiavelli, and of course Marx. Gramsci's developed his theories of cultural hegemony in what are now called the prison notebooks, a long series of essays he wrote while imprisoned by the Italian fascist regime from 1926 to 1935. Now, I don't want to put words in Gramsci's mouth, but I like to think that these notebooks started with him looking out the window of his prison cell and being like, "What? Seriously? Fascism? What the hell's going on here? Why would anybody in like a zillion years ever be like, oh yeah, fascism, let's do this. What could possibly go wrong?" Anyways, Gramsci died shortly after his release due to his deteriorating health from his living conditions while in prison. But the theories that he developed while in prison lived on. Now, like the Shawshank Redemption of intellectual theory, his ideas slowly drilled their way into the consciousness of cultural theory. His notebooks were smuggled out of prison and were eventually published in the 1950s and then translated into English in the 1970s and have since taken behavioral science by storm. Now, his theories are dense and complex, and it's obvious that he was in stressful conditions while he was writing them, but once you get a rough idea of what he was mapping out, it's not too hard to see what he was trying to say. Let's start by looking at some easy examples of how power and cultural work was something that you may have already heard before. It's called The Riddle of Steel, and it's from the 1982 movie Conan the Barbarian.
The riddle of steel.
Yes. You know what it is, don't you, boy? Shall I tell you? It's the least I can do. Steel isn't strong, boy. Flesh is stronger. Look around you. There, on the rocks, that beautiful girl. Come to me, my child. That is strength, boy. That is power.
So, putting it in terms that Gramsci would agree with, the riddle of steel is the recognition that weapons are nothing compared to the belief of the people that are wielding the weapons. Or, to put it differently, controlling a person's loyalty is the key to power. For Gramsci, power comes from consent, and according to him, it originates in subtle, otherwise innocuous types of agreement. Gramsci further challenges us by suggesting this process is even more complicated than it may first seem, by suggesting that people don't control ideas, but rather ideas control people. Or, to put it differently, people don't wield power. Power wields people. Here's an example of this in action. Over in the U.S., we're edging up on the 2016 elections. Elections are a great time to watch hegemony in action. So, take a typical Joe. At some point, Joe will be presented with a political ideology. This ideology will include pleasant-sounding ideas and beliefs, often very vaguely defined, that Joe may agree with. Once Joe decides that he agrees with that ideology or political party, then he'll make all of his political decisions from that point on, not from his own judgment, but from the answers that his political ideology has decided for him. That, my friends, is hegemony. But don't judge Joe too harshly. We do this sort of thing all the time. For example, I'm going to bet that a lot of you put a pine tree, or maybe even a plastic pine tree, in your house this Christmas and decorated it with plastic ornaments. Why? Why a pine tree? Why not some other type of tree? Or, another example, men often give women a diamond ring when they propose to them. Why? Why not some other type of pretty rock? Or why do we grow grass in our front yards instead of, food? Now, the point Gramsci wants to make isn't that we should weigh the merit of these particular traditions in and of themselves necessarily, but rather that we need to pay attention to how these ideas got put in our head in the first place. You didn't think of the idea of putting trees indoors, or rocks on rings, or growing inedible crops. These ideas were given to you, and they are the ideas that literally control your actions, at least in the sense that you exhibit specific behaviors and actions simply because these ideas are in your head. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are political, economic, religious, and ethnic ideas, all of which you accept passively, that govern your actions and behaviors every day. It's actually kind of frightening when you realize how many things you do every day without having any idea why you're doing them. And this collective influence of all these different ideas on your actions is what Gramsci meant by cultural hegemony. So, let's try to tease out some helpful metaphors that can give us some insight into hegemony by taking a quick jump into the plot of some classic movies. Let's start with Lord Voldemort from Harry Potter. Remember how for the first half of the story, people wouldn't even say his name out loud? Looking at that behavior from a hegemonic point of view, we can see that the behavior wasn't just an expression of Voldemort's power, it actually was his power. If you wouldn't say his name, you were indirectly consenting to the belief in his authority and expressing that belief in your actions. The only exception, of course, being our hero, Harry Potter, who wouldn't concede to Voldemort's power even in a social convention. That's standing up to cultural hegemony. Another helpful example is J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Tolkien did a brilliant job of never really going into much detail about what the ring's magical powers actually were. That's because, like the plastic pine tree in your house on Christmas, the thing in and of itself is, as a point of fact, rather uninteresting. It's the idea of the thing, the concept of the thing, and the ways in which that idea affect people's behavior that demonstrates real power. Here's another, simpler example. Disney's Aladdin. The metaphor for power here is quite obviously the magical genie. But notice how the power of the genie drags Aladdin into a behavior that goes against his nature. When Aladdin gets the princess, he does so through a web of lies that were given credit to by his acceptance of the genie's power. And this is the point where power starts to wield people. In order to keep the magic alive, Aladdin has to act in a way that he doesn't actually want to participate in, but he must to preserve the web of dishonesty that got him there in the first place. And he isn't genuinely free until he lets the genie go. Likewise, Frodo isn't free until he lets go of his burden. Or Harry Potter, who eventually wins by literally getting Voldemort out of his head, like physically. I mean, they were a little on the nose with that one. Voldemort was something that was put into Harry's mind when he couldn't think for himself as a child. Well played, Rowling. Well played. So, our next question is, how do we put these ideas into practical use? Well, enter Pierre Bourdieu and his work on what he calls field theory. Now, bear in mind this is just one of many approaches to hegemony, but for a video of this size, Bourdieu seems like the sensible choice. So, Bourdieu complicates Gramsci's ideas by trying to situate them in the real day-to-day world of social life. Bourdieu argues that each of us are constantly navigating our way through various fields. These fields consist of any number of social networks like where you work, where you hang out, where you go to school, etc. And when you enter into one or more of these fields, you adopt various identities, and these identities offer various advantages or disadvantages depending on the situation. So looking at just one person, we can see that the individual is a focal point upon which a huge amount of symbols and ideas and beliefs are anchored. This individual, in turn, makes their way through this web of symbols by adopting various identities in different situations. These identities are coded, and the individual expresses these identities depending on their circumstances at any given moment. If we couple Bourdieu with Gramsci, we'll notice an interesting parallel, namely that the identities that the individual adopts are constructed out of symbols that the individual themselves didn't create. That is to say, according to Bourdieu, your identity is given to you by society rather than created by you. This begs a further question. Given the situation, who is the authentic you? And can that individual ever actually be expressed in a way that isn't embedded in a web of symbols that are themselves all networked in structures of power? Well, that's a question we can ask a little further down the road, perhaps. But for now, let's assume that there actually is a distinct you in the middle of that bubble of symbols. And that you, and the bubble around you, are what Bourdieu calls the habitus. And the habitus provides us with a way to measure and gauge where you are in the network of culture. This network, in turn, which is made up of millions of little habitus bubbles, is the overall mechanism which decides the course of political, economic, and cultural action. For example, if the collective habitus of a particular group is fashioned appropriately, then you can predict how that group will act towards another group, say by teaching one group to hate the word terrorist and then labeling another group terrorist. You can now control how both groups will act. This is hegemony. This is also, quite often, very overwhelming to deal with, especially seeing as any scholar trying to work on this type of thing is quick to notice that they themselves will inevitably be caught in a web of hegemony of some sort, and thus have their own behavior measured and controlled by whatever narrative it is that they have identified with. This being the case, most behavioral scientists break this approach into smaller subsets like political, economic, religious, or cultural hegemony. But while it is a challenging theory, it can still be useful. Here's a way you can try it yourself by keeping an eye out for a phenomenon called code switching. Say you and your friends are playing video games. While you're in this field, you're probably going to adopt a very particular identity, one that includes a relaxed and playful way of speaking. Then, let's say, work calls. As soon as you answer the phone, your way of speaking and acting will change. You'll tend to be more formal and structured in the way that you address the person on the phone. If your friends are paying attention, they'll know that you're talking to your boss based simply off the change in your behavior. And this is what we mean when we say code switching. It's an indicator that lets you know that hegemony is at play. Learning to see this kind of thing will allow you to get a better idea of where you are in the complex matrix of cultural power, and hopefully will allow you to start choosing your beliefs and actions more deliberately, so that eventually, like Aladdin, someday you too will be able to free yourself from the prison of cultural hegemony and truly think for yourself. Well, we're running out of time for this episode. Feel free to leave examples of what you see as cultural hegemony in the comments. As always, thanks for watching. Do a man a favor, hit that good old subscribe button, and we'll see you next time. Until then, keep on thinking.